Over 300 piles of human ashes dumped, abandoned, and left baking in the scorching heat of the Mojave Desert. Just an hour south of the neon lights of Las Vegas, near the quiet town of Searchlight, Nevada, a man was walking down an isolated dirt road and made a horrifying discovery. What he found has sparked one of the most baffling, unsolved mysteries of the decade. Who left hundreds of human cremated remains scattered across federal public land? Was this the work of a rogue, bankrupt mortuary trying to hide a massive secret? Or is there something darker hiding in the Nevada desert that federal investigators aren't telling us? Today, we are deep diving into the Mojave Desert Ashes Dumping Mystery. And, well, let's get spooky. There was a discovery in the desert that would trigger a sprawling federal investigation, expose a deep systemic crisis within the death care industry. The story starts on July 28th, 2025. A local resident was traveling along a remote, unnamed dirt road near Searchlight, Nevada. Searchlight is a small, unincorporated desert community of approximately 400 people. The passerby found a surreal scene. Dozens of small, uniform gray piles scattered across the dusty ground of federal land managed by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. The resident reported the find, and this came to the attention of David Charnes, an investigative reporter for the local Las Vegas television station 8 News Now. Operating on this viewer tip, Charnes and his news team traveled to the remote site and documented the initial cluster. At first, there appeared to be approximately 70 distinct piles of what looked like human cremated remains. The evidence was captured by cameras, and it looked bizarre. The gray ash had been unceremoniously dropped in distinct cluster mounds against the backdrop of the rugged desert brush and cacti. As the Bureau of Land Management and the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department launched a joint investigation into the bizarre dumping ground, the magnitude of the situation became clear. What began as 70 piles quickly escalated as federal investigators and local law enforcement combed the desolate stretch of land. By autumn of 2025, the official count of recovered remains had skyrocketed. Authorities mapped and documented 315 distinct sets of pulverized human bone fragments, commonly referred to as cremains. The scene painted a grim picture. Alongside the ashes, investigators discovered critical clues, pieces of heavy-duty plastic zip ties and fragments of broken transit urns. In the commercial funeral industry, zip ties are universally utilized to securely seal the thick, clear plastic bags containing cremated remains before those bags are placed inside temporary cardboard boxes or plastic transit urns. The fact that these severed ties were scattered among the ashes means that there was likely that some company, some commercial funeral home, had undergone a disposal operation. And they didn't take the time to care for or scatter the ashes respectively. Rather, they had transported boxes of unclaimed remains to the site, pulled out the sealed bags, and sliced them open or cut the zip ties and dumped the contents in a careless manner before abandoning the site entirely. This was the unauthorized dumping of human remains. This required a callous act on behalf of the people responsible, weighing the risk of federal prosecution against the immediate financial convenience of clearing a massive backlog of cremains. Law enforcement's immediate priority was investigation. Families had to be notified. The deceased had to be accounted for. And there had to be a chain of custody established to determine who was responsible. But the properties of cremated remains make forensic identification an almost impossible challenge for investigators. The commercial cremation process is an act of total destruction. It subjects the human body to extreme temperatures within a specialized furnace known as a retort. The temperatures typically range between 1400 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for a period of several hours. At these extreme temperatures, all organic matter is vaporized. Soft tissues, internal organs, and cellular DNA are completely destroyed. What remains at the end of the retort cycle is brittle calcified bone fragments consisting largely of calcium phosphate. These bone fragments are then swept from the cremation chamber and processed through an industrial machine known as a cremulator. The cremulator is like a heavy-duty grinder, pulverizing the skeletal remains into a coarse gray sand. Because the intense heat destroys the genetic material necessary for DNA extraction. Forensic anthropologists can't rely on traditional identification methods to match the ashes to missing persons databases or familiar DNA registries. In some cases, identification with cremains can be aided by the presence of surgical implants. Items like steel pins, hip joints, pacemakers, or dental fillings can often survive the heat of the retort. Reputable crematories use a strict tracking system, placing a stamped fireproof metal identification disc inside the retort with the body, which then stays with the cremains all the way into the final urn to guarantee identity. However, the evidence from the Searchlight investigation suggests that whoever dumped the remains deliberately removed these identifiers to obscure the origin of the ashes, leaving investigators with no traceable information to salvage from the desert. Despite these forensic hurdles, investigators did achieve a minor breakthrough. Out of the 315 piles recovered from the dirt road, authorities successfully identified 3 individuals. Stephanie McGee, the executive director of the Nevada Funeral and Cemetery Services Board, confirmed the IDs but declined to comment publicly on how these 3 sets of remains were identified, saying it was an ongoing, highly sensitive investigation. It's likely that the people who were responsible were simply careless, accidentally leaving a partially labeled plastic bag, intact tag, or a funeral fragment bearing an identifiable serial number that investigators would be able to track. For the remaining 312 individuals, the investigators say that identification is likely impossible. The reality of the Searchlight dumping ground is that hundreds of families in southern Nevada, and maybe even across the entire country, will forever be denied the closure of receiving their loved ones' ashes. They will remain completely unaware that their loved ones were dumped away on a dirt road rather than resting peacefully wherever they were promised to be and where they likely paid to have their loved ones dispersed. This Searchlight discovery exposes a complex intersection of state and federal law regarding the final disposition of human remains. The legality of scattering ashes depends on a few factors: the identity of the actor, the volume of the remains, and the specific ownership of the land where the disposition is meant to occur. Under Nevada state law, the scattering of cremated remains is pretty much unregulated. There is no overarching ban preventing private individuals from taking the ashes of loved ones and scattering them across public lands, waterways, or other desolate areas of the state. To a grieving family wishing to return a deceased relative to the natural environment of the Mojave Desert, doing that is completely legal, and it's widely considered a protected form of private memorialization. State law prioritizes the emotional needs of the family over strict environmental regulation in these types of circumstances. However, the Searchlight dumping ground was located on federal land, managed by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. The BLM generally attempts to mirror state leniency, allowing private individuals to scatter small, isolated quantities of cremains on its massive tracts of land. But the agency draws a hard line at commercial activity. While cremated remains are not classified as hazardous material, the large-scale commercial distribution on federal land is illegal. The rationale behind this restriction is that mass scattering or dumping interferes with other permitted land uses, and it creates localized anomalies that can disturb natural habitats. The coordinated dumping of 315 bags of human remains crossed the line from a private memorial to commercial waste disposal. What might have been a minor state-level administrative violation if it was done by a single confused individual became a severe federal investigation overseen by the Department of the Interior, working with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. It's almost impossible to understand why a commercial funeral home or crematory would resort to this desperate illegal act, the act of dumping hundreds of human remains in the desert. But there are economic pressures fracturing the Las Vegas death care industry since the mid-2020s. The Searchlight discovery might be a symptom of a broader cremation crisis plaguing southern Nevada. In recent years, the national cremation rate has surged past 60%, driven by changing religious attitudes, transient populations, and the high cost of traditional burial. Las Vegas has a highly transient demographic, an influx of retirees separated from their extended families, and a significant amount of unhoused people. That means the Las Vegas area experiences cremation higher than the national average. So the industry is burdened by the crisis of unclaimed remains. Across the United States, funeral homes are silently hoarding thousands of abandoned urns in backrooms, closets, and basements. Families frequently fail to collect the ashes of their loved ones due to distance or an inability to pay a final cremation bill, or maybe even emotional estrangement or negligence. Legally, a funeral home acts as a temporary custodian of these remains. State laws vary on how long a business must hold on to unclaimed ashes before they can legally dispose of them, but the process is difficult almost everywhere. It requires retaining the ashes for a period of years, followed by sending certified letters to last known addresses, publishing public notices in local newspapers, and eventually paying for the interment in a cemetery's common grave. For an independent funeral home, a closet filled with 300 abandoned urns is a massive, unresolved legal and financial liability. If the business owner wishes to retire, sell the property, or transfer ownership to a different corporate entity, the presence of these remains becomes a logistical nightmare. People or companies buying funeral homes usually refuse to assume the liability of a previous owner's unclaimed remains, forcing the outgoing owner to resolve the backlog before the ink on the sales contract can dry. There's a financial burden of paying for 315 proper cemetery interments that could easily bankrupt a failing funeral home, which provides a dark and powerful motive for what happened at Searchlight. Something happened in August of 2025 that is a parallel to the Searchlight incident. The Nevada State Board of Funeral and Cemetery Services aggressively intervened to shut down McDermott's funeral home and cremation services, a prominent Las Vegas facility owned and directed by Chris Grant. The closure followed a series of gruesome state inspections and mounting complaints by, well, I guess you would call them consumers, that had been accumulating since 2021. Inspectors detailed a facility that quite literally smelled of death. One harrowing inspection report described the discovery of 3 coolers containing numerous bodies that were leaking blood and bodily fluids directly onto the floor and dripping onto other bodies stored on lower shelves. The breakdown of operations at McDermott's was staggering. The state board found that the funeral home had routinely failed to cremate bodies within a reasonable time frame. The board documented cases where grieving families experienced agonizing delays of where a human body was left uncremated in a facility for 11 months. After the McDermott's operating license was revoked, the Clark County Coroner's Office was forced to orchestrate a mass emergency transfer of 146 bodies from the failing facility to a more stable funeral home. Because of the timing of the McDermott shutdown in August 2025, rumors immediately swirled through Las Vegas that the 315 piles of ashes in the desert were a direct result of McDermott's operators attempting to rapidly clear out their backlog of unclaimed remains before state inspectors could seize the facility. However, investigators have denied this connection. Officials explicitly confirmed that the desert remains are not connected to McDermott's funeral home. It's a chilling example of the pressures that could drive another funeral home operator to commit this type of crime in the desert. There's an immense human toll behind the collapse of facilities like the McDermott's and whatever mortuary was responsible for the Searchlight dump. It's easy to just call them regulatory violations, but behind every pile of ash, there's a family subjected to profound secondary trauma. When a family hands over a loved one after the loved one passes, they are engaging in an act of trust. Whether a body is left to rot in a broken cooler for 11 months or pulverized and dumped alongside 300 others on a dirt road in Searchlight, Nevada, the violation remains the same: the abandonment of their loved ones. If McDermott's funeral home was ruled out as the perpetrator of the Searchlight dump, then who was responsible? The forensic evidence of the industry point to a specific demographic of commercial operator. Investigators believe they are hunting a funeral business that has recently closed or swapped hands. Federal investigators have reportedly narrowed their focus to a specific commercial funeral home that fits this profile. Local investigative journalists have contacted the leadership of this unnamed funeral home, which is reportedly based out of state but operated within the Las Vegas market. However, representatives from the company have repeatedly and vehemently denied any involvement in the desert dumping. I would suggest that they lawyer up. The theory is that instead of paying a cemetery thousands of dollars to properly inter the 315 unclaimed individuals, they loaded the temporary plastic and cardboard urns into a car. They then drove an hour south into the anonymity of the Mojave Desert, pulled off the highway near Searchlight, and systematically dumped their inventory onto the desert floor. This type of failure is not isolated to just Nevada. It's a deep problem within the death care industry. Operators prioritizing profit and convenience over the sacred duty of the final disposition of people, exploiting the fact that dead people can't advocate for themselves. The federal investigation into the Searchlight dumping ground has not had any immediate public arrests yet. And the immediate practical concern for the community became the recovery and proper disposition of the 315 individuals. In late October 2025, about 3 months after the discovery, crews from the Palm Mortuaries and cemeteries volunteered to undertake the task of recovering the remains. Palm Mortuaries is a brand in the Las Vegas Valley, owned by the Service Corporation International, the largest publicly traded death care corporation in North America. Bet you didn't know that there were publicly traded death care corporations in America, but there you go. Professional mortuary crews gathered the 315 piles of ash from the land. They worked to place the dust and bone fragments into secure individual urns. Palm then transferred the recovered remains to a dedicated cemetery crypt, ensuring that they are finally interred with a baseline level of dignity. This act of corporate responsibility showed that the industry had a desire to rehabilitate its public image amid this ongoing cremation crisis. The 2025 discovery of the vanished human ashes in the Mojave Desert stand as one of the most uniquely disturbing chapters in the modern history of the American death care industry. It represents a staggering collapse of human empathy and human decency. Over 300 individuals who had loved ones, had experiences, had history, were systematically reduced to an anonymous logistical burden by the very people that were paid to care for them. They were shipped out of Las Vegas under the cover of the desert sun, and their remains discarded like industrial waste along a desolate junction of highway. Thanks only to the timely intervention of a local resident, the persistent reporting of local journalists, and the volunteer efforts of corporate mortuary recovery teams, these individuals have been rescued from total physical erasure. The 315 urns now sit securely in a crypt at Palm Cemetery, offering a semblance of dignity that they were once promised. They rest there in a secured collective memorial, a quiet, enduring testament to the truth that the measure of society is ultimately reflected in how it cares for those who can no longer care for themselves. Subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member of the channel. I appreciate you considering that. You can also support the channel by continuing to watch and share my videos, and I do appreciate you watching my videos. And please stay spooky.